when I practiced law, and I don't anymore, I've got a little card that says I'm a lawyer, but it says inactive across it in big letters. Just in case I'm tempted to give anybody legal advice, I don't do it anymore. But during the time that I did it, while I was practicing here in Rifle, I was an ARRL volunteer counsel. And that is a thing that you apply for, and they give you nice certificate. The ARRL is great on certificates, so they give you a great certificate for your wall. And in case anybody calls the ARRL with legal questions, they call you and you give free legal advice. And the only thing I ever got any questions over the maybe 25 years I did that was about antennas. And the only thing about antennas really was how to make it through the bureaucracy in order to be allowed to put up whatever it is that you want. Now, for those of you who follow such things, the answer is usually go buy something in the county and don't tell anybody when you put it up, just do it. But several years ago, the ARRL sponsored and the FCC passed a rule-making procedure called PRB-1, which said that amateur radio is important. Because amateur radio is important, local governments can't interfere with, when local governments put a restriction on your right to have an antenna, they have to keep some things in mind. And those things are basically three of them. If they're going to restrict your use of an antenna, it has to be based on something other than just, we don't like antennas. It's got to be based on health, safety, or aesthetic considerations, be crafted to accommodate amateur communications, and represent the minimum practical regulation required to accomplish the local government's legitimate purpose. I don't know how many of you have heard that or followed that. If any of you heard PRB-1 before?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it sounds good and it's essentially worthless. Because what happens when you tried to use that, when you went to your local zoning official, is they say, ha, there's the federal government again trying to intrude in local affairs. You know, take a walk. And it had essentially no effect. And so what had to do is what Ken did, KB0HP. And I don't know if you've seen his antenna, but he lives in Rifle. He's got a good size beam on a crank-up tower, and he made it through the zoning process in the city of Rifle. Now, there's several different places that you run into problems or issues when you're trying to put up an antenna. The first is if you live in a city, there's the zoning code. The zoning code no doubt says something about your antenna and about antennas and heights and where they're restricted and what areas they can be in. And it usually provides, as it did in Rifle, for a process whereby the Planning Commission would look at what you're proposing to put up. You had to put a sign in the front, notify your neighbors, and if they objected, then the Planning Commission would make a decision as to whether or not you'd be allowed to put it up. Ken did it right. He went through the process. He made a beautiful PowerPoint presentation of what his antenna would look like that was it was actually fairly accurate. He could have been a little sneaky, I think, and made it look less conspicuous than it did. But it looked okay. He did everything. He went and talked to his neighbors. His neighbors either they didn't disagree or they didn't agree. Well, they didn't disagree and they didn't jump up and protest. And when he went to the Planning Commission needed to be educated about what amateur radio is and why he needed to have an antenna and why one that you put in the roof or in the attic really isn't adequate. You need something better than that. And they granted it to him. Now, that was Rifle. Other places are not so accommodating. Aspen, for example, is probably the least accommodating that there is. I really had no dealings with antenna people here in Glenwood Springs, but I did, during the course of this volunteer council appointment, I did talk to people in Gunnison and Durango and Colorado Springs and such, and they were having a terrible time making it through just the local planners who didn't know what antennas were. All they could think of were schlocky CB antennas that would fall over and look really bad and not look aesthetically pleasing, and they were very poorly constructed. Well, the good news from that standpoint is that the Colorado legislature in its current session, and you may think that there's political gridlock and that they can't accomplish anything, but the fact is that they did. They passed, and Governor Hickenlooper signed about 3 weeks ago, something called Senate Bill 15041. I'm going to pass this around for you so you can read it. And in case and I made 25 copies, and I don't know if there's enough for everybody. But if you're the least bit interested in this, you might want to keep it. That's a copy of the act that was passed by the legislature. It basically engrafts in Colorado law the requirement of PRB-1, which specifically says that, which says that no local government shall enact or enforce ordinance or resolution regarding amateur radio antennas that doesn't take into account those three factors. It gives you a right to put up your antenna, the right to use, the restrictions have to be based on health, safety, or aesthetic, be crafted to reasonably accommodate amateur communication, and represent the minimum practical regulations required. Now those who are lawyers here will probably raise a red flag and say, wait a minute, what about home rule cities? Because home rule cities traditionally don't have to follow state laws. This may or may not help you. But what it will do, if you ever need this situation, is it will give you credibility. And when you go and talk to the planner, I mean, they're not necessarily against what you're trying to do. But when you go and talk to the planner, you can say, look, by the way, not only is this something worthwhile, but the legislature thought so, because here's the law that says that it's legitimate. And in the cases I dealt with, in most cases we were able to get something by it. What may not have been what the person wanted, but it worked. That's hurdle number one, is the local planning people, and this is going to help you. Number two are the building officials. And you cannot possibly explain to me what the International Building Code says about antennas, because if any of you have dealt with the International Building Code, which is the one that's been adopted by nearly everybody now, you can make it say anything you want it to. And when I was researching this issue, I went through Mesa County, which is where I live now, and they do the building inspection for all the cities plus the Mesa County. And their feeling is that they really don't care so long as wherever you put it up, if it falls over and it won't hurt anybody else, they don't care. But if you put it up and if it falls over and it's likely to hurt somebody else, then they want to know about it. Rifle took a different approach. And Ken, why don't you tell briefly what you had to do with the building department?
I had to make a presentation to show them exactly where the antenna was going to be and how tall it was going to be, and they asked me if I would be willing to lower the antenna when not in use, and I said I would be, and so aesthetically that would be more helpful with the neighbors, and they were very accommodating. They voted unanimously with me, so I was very happy.
And you also had to have the building inspector come out to make sure that your giant chunk of concrete back there,
yes,
it will not go anywhere.
Different phases at the beginning, there was probably 3 or 4 different times when they came to inspect the installation and the progress, and then the final inspection. And each time it was just take a look at it, and they had no problems. So
it can be done. What this does not solve, and what this was not addressed, is the biggest issue with most people and their antennas, and those are covenants and homeowners associations. And I happen to know that because I live in a covenant-controlled community, and the covenant Nazi lives directly across the street from me. And the third thing she said when she noticed my ham radio antennas was, of course, we don't allow antennas. We will not allow you to put up an antenna. Well, okay. I'm going to have to put up something sneaky. It's either temporary or in the attic, because I will not be able to put up an antenna. And if you live in a covenant-controlled community, or if you are unable to make it past your homeowners association, do not expect to go to the courts and get any help. Because the courts are going to tell you, you chose to live there. This is part of your covenants that you could have seen before you bought the house, and tough luck. I think almost never are the decisions of a homeowners association or covenants like that overturned to allow you to put up the kind of antenna you want to. I suspect from looking around at the people shaking their heads that others have had similar situations or similar discussions with their covenant, their local version of the covenant Nazi, or with the covenants that exist. Now, that is a very touchy issue because although you want to put up an antenna, your neighbors also have a right to have the neighborhood look like it did when they bought it. And courts do not like to interfere in that sort of thing, and they're not going to. In this month's QST, if you take a look at a kind of an obscure article past all the cool antennas, there is an article about the Amateur Radio Parity Act of 2015. I love how the Congress gives goofball names to things. And again, this is may actually sneak through Congress and the Senate if nobody raises any big stink. It was introduced by a Republican from Illinois, co-sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats. And what it does is it applies that test to private covenants and to homeowners associations. And the FCC has refused to do it. They took the initial step at the ARRL's suggestion of passing PRB-1, which dealt with local governments. They refused to do this because they thought it was too politically unpopular for them to interfere in private contracts and private agreements, unless Congress told them that they should, and that's exactly what this does. You might take a look at the article, because if that passes, again, it's not going to help us right now immediately, but in the future it may well assist us if that passes, and then if a local or a similar thing passes in the Colorado legislature, give us some credibility when you're arguing with or discussing it with, or hopefully not ever having to sue, but whenever you have to deal with your homeowners association or the covenants that you've got. You will notice that there are a number of, well, there's now 35 co-sponsors in the House. Unfortunately, nobody from Colorado is a co-sponsor on either side of the party. If either one of you know our local representative Tipton and have any influence with him or with his staff, you might write him a letter saying, here's something that you could sponsor that would really be of help and of value. And it has fairly wide bipartisan support. The only way it's going to make it is if it kind of sneaks through under the radar and doesn't end up with all the screaming heads that you see in Washington. But again, I would urge you to take a look at this. And if you know Tipton, it hasn't shown up in the Senate, but it's in the House, suggest that he might want to co-sponsor that.
What page is that?
It is page 77 of the QST that you just got. Or at least, I don't know if you just got it, I just got it about 3 days ago.
It's available electronically.
And you can get it online. Okay, well all I wanted to do is to let you know that the Colorado legislature, way under the radar, has actually done something really nice for us. And I'm really glad they did, because I think that's fairly significant. Okay, that's it.
Quick question, so,
Sure.
I basically took the attitude of, it's better to say I'm sorry than to say it didn't ask permission.
Sure. That's also a legitimate approach.
And, as far as I can tell, there's no enforcement mechanism active in my neighborhood for covenant enforcement, unless, I'm sure if something really got out of hand, they'd find somebody, but, what's the most they could do? They can fine you, I suppose, but, if you take it down, if they say, well, take that antenna down, it's like, if you take it down, there's really no,
I don't know what
they can't go back
I
and
don't know
say,
what Bob's experience
they can't
is.
go back 2 years ago and
You
say,
want
well,
to
you
bet?
put that up and we're gonna
want to
fine you
bet?
for back 2 years. Okay, that was.
I don't know what Bob's experience has been, but mine has been that most covenants basically are put into place by a developer who is too cheap to pay a lawyer to do it right.
Yeah.
And consequently, they cut and paste from everybody else. They really don't know what's in there. And they're never meant to be enforced. And the worst nightmare is if you live in a place such as Babylon Mesa, in which you have a lot of highly educated people with a lot of time on their hands. And they read it, and they find these things, and then they try to enforce it. And I'm not really sure if there is a statute of limitation on their enforcing a covenant. If you have had it there for 18 years, maybe you could get away with it. But the fact that you can put it up and that nobody's argued with you now doesn't mean that 6 months, a year, 2 years from now, someone else might come in and say, hey, that looks really ugly, take it down. And by the way, you've had it there for 5 years and we're going to impose a $50 a day fine. And the courts generally agree with those things. The best thing to do, and the thing that worked for the person in Gunnison, is to get elected as the president of the Homeowners Association.
And, you know, I guess, you know, the other thing is, of course, you know, pointing out that all the RVs parked on the streets that aren't supposed to be there,
Yeah.
that sort of thing, and say, well, why aren't you going after that guy?
So there, you know, that's called equal protection.
Yeah.
And it applies when you're arguing with the government, but this isn't the government. It's a private organization that you voluntarily joined when you bought a house there, whether you wanted to or not. So be inconspicuous and be really nice to your neighbors.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, all right.
Nice to your neighbors is our
Yeah.
Is it, Bob? Is